The music stopped the moment Lady Beatrice Lowell said the word no. It was not a whisper. It was not meant to be kind. She said it loudly enough that every candle in the ballroom seemed to flicker in shock, loudly enough that the string quartet lost their place, loudly enough that Duke Julian Hale, who had just gone down on one knee in front of 300 guests, felt the floor tilt beneath him. "No," Beatrice said again, as if the first refusal had not been humiliating enough. "I will not marry you, Your Grace. I have received a better offer." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Fans opened. Whispers began before the Duke had even risen from his knee. He stood slowly, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding out in front of every person who mattered in London society. Somewhere near the punch table, a woman laughed behind her glove, not bothering to hide it. Julian had not expected love from Beatrice Lowell. He had expected obedience. Her father owed him money, and marriage would have settled the debt quietly, the way these things were usually settled among people of rank. He had not planned to feel anything when he asked her, but he had not planned to be laughed at either. He looked around the ballroom, searching for somewhere to put his humiliation, and that was when he saw her. Eleanor Lowell stood near the far wall, half hidden behind a pillar, wearing a gown that had clearly been altered from an older one to fit the season's fashion. She was not looking at him with pity, the way so many others were. She was looking at her sister with something closer to exhaustion, as though this scene, this exact kind of scene, had played out in her family 100 times before, and she was simply waiting for it to end. Julian did not think. He crossed the ballroom floor, his boots striking the marble in sharp, deliberate steps, and stopped in front of the younger Lowell sister before his own mind had caught up with his body. "Miss Lowell," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The silence that followed was different from the first one. That silence had been amused. This one was stunned. Eleanor's eyes widened. For a moment she said nothing at all, and Julian wondered if he had made the worst mistake of his life, worse even than kneeling in front of Beatrice. Then Eleanor looked past him, toward her sister, toward her mother's pale, frightened face, toward the crowd that had already begun whispering her name for the first time in years. She had spent her whole life being the sister no one noticed. Now every eye in the room was on her. "Yes," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I will." The ballroom erupted into noise again, louder this time, hungrier. Beatrice's face went white, then red, then something colder that Julian did not have time to study, because Eleanor had placed her gloved hand in his, and the vicar's assistant, sensing an opportunity for gossip that would follow him for years, was already hurrying toward them to offer his congratulations. It happened so quickly that neither of them had time to think about what they had done. They were married 11 days later in a small chapel with none of the grandeur the Lowell family usually insisted upon. Eleanor's mother wept through the entire ceremony, though whether from joy or grief was not clear even to her. Her father stood stiffly beside the aisle, relieved beyond words that the Duke's debt forgiveness would still apply, regardless of which daughter wore the ring. Beatrice did not attend. Julian said his vows in a flat, practiced voice, the voice of a man conducting business. Eleanor said hers more quietly, but without hesitation, and if anyone noticed that the bride and groom did not look at each other once during the entire ceremony, no one dared to mention it. That night, in the carriage that carried them away from the chapel toward Ravensworth, his family estate, Julian finally spoke to her, as a person rather than a solution to a public embarrassment. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking out the window rather than at her. "What happened tonight was not fair to you. You were not given a choice in any real sense." "I had a choice," Eleanor said simply. "I said yes. Because you were standing in a room full of people who had just watched your sister humiliate me. You did not have time to think." "I have had my whole life to think, Your Grace." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I have thought about very little else besides standing in rooms while people looked past me. Tonight, for the first time, someone looked directly at me and asked me a question. I am not sorry I answered it." Julian turned from the window then and studied her properly for the first time, not as Beatrice's forgettable younger sister, but as the woman who was now his wife. She was not beautiful in the way society measured beauty, not in the way Beatrice was. Her features were plainer, her hair a simple brown rather than the golden curls poets wrote about. But there was something steady in her eyes that Beatrice had never possessed, something that did not flinch even now, hours after the worst public embarrassment of her family's recent history. "I should tell you plainly what this marriage is," Julian said, because he believed in honesty even when it was unkind. "It is a convenience, nothing more. I needed a wife tonight, and you accepted before I could think better of the offer. I will provide for you. You will want for nothing, but I do not intend for this to become anything more than what it is." Eleanor's expression did not change, though something in her posture straightened, as though she were bracing herself against a wind only she could feel. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she said. "I did not marry you for romance. I married you because it was, for once, my own decision, and not my sister's leftover choice handed down to me." He had not expected an answer like that. He had expected tears, or false gratitude, or the kind of simpering agreement he had grown used to from young women trying to please him. Instead, she had simply told him the truth, plainly, without asking anything of him in return. "Then we understand each other," he said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "We do." The carriage rattled on through the dark countryside, past hedgerows and sleeping villages, and neither of them spoke again until the towers of Ravensworth rose against the night sky, dark and enormous, lit only by a scattering of windows. The estate was larger than anything Eleanor had imagined, larger even than the descriptions whispered about it in London drawing rooms. Stone walls stretched in every direction, and the grounds seemed to swallow the carriage whole as they approached the entrance. A row of servants stood waiting on the front steps, their faces carefully arranged into polite neutrality, though Eleanor could see curiosity behind more than one pair of eyes. An older woman stepped forward first, her posture rigid, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. This was Mrs. Dobson, the housekeeper, and though her greeting was correct in every particular, there was a coolness in her voice that told Eleanor exactly how she was expected to be regarded within these walls, as an afterthought, a substitute, a woman who had been chosen by accident rather than intention. "Welcome to Ravensworth, Your Grace," Mrs. Dobson said, addressing Julian first, then turning to Eleanor with only slightly less formality. "And welcome to you as well, my lady." "Thank you, Mrs. Dobson," Eleanor said, and she made certain her voice carried, made certain it did not waver or apologize for existing, the way she had trained herself not to do in front of her sister for years. Julian excused himself almost immediately, citing correspondence that could not wait, though Eleanor suspected the letters were simply an excuse to avoid an evening of forced conversation with a wife he had married out of impulse and wounded pride. She did not blame him. She was, in many ways, relieved to have the evening to herself. Mrs. Dobson led her through the house, pointing out rooms with clipped efficiency, the library, the morning room, the long gallery lined with portraits of Hale ancestors who all seemed to share the same disapproving eyebrows. Finally, they reached a bedchamber at the end of a quiet corridor, far from the master's rooms, decorated in faded blue silk that had clearly not been refreshed in a decade. "This will be your room, my lady," Mrs. Dobson said. "His Grace's chambers are in the west wing, should you require anything of him." The distance in that sentence was not lost on Eleanor. Separate rooms, separate wings. A marriage conducted through messages passed between servants rather than words exchanged face to face. She had known this was the arrangement, had agreed to it in the carriage, and yet standing here now, in this cold and unfamiliar room, the reality of it settled over her more heavily than she had expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobson," she said. "That will be all for tonight." The housekeeper hesitated at the door, as though she wanted to say something further, then apparently thought better of it and left without another word. Alone, Eleanor sat on the edge of the enormous bed and allowed herself, for the first time since the ballroom, to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had left her family home a nobody, the forgotten sister, the one nobody bothered writing poems about, and she had arrived at Ravensworth a duchess in name only, married to a man who had proposed to her out of desperation, and told her within hours that he expected nothing from the arrangement beyond convenience. And yet, she had said yes. She had chosen this, in the only moment of her adult life when a choice had truly belonged to her. Beatrice had spent years choosing for both of them, deciding which suitors were worth Eleanor's attention, which gowns suited her better, which conversations Eleanor was permitted to join. Tonight, for the first time, Eleanor had made a decision entirely her own, in front of everyone who had ever underestimated her. She rose from the bed and walked to the window. Below, the moonlit gardens stretched out in careful rows, hedges clipped into geometric shapes, a fountain standing silent and dry in the center of a stone courtyard. It was beautiful in a neglected sort of way, as though the estate itself had been waiting a long time for someone to care for it properly. Eleanor decided, in that quiet moment, that she would not spend her marriage waiting to be noticed the way she had spent her girlhood waiting for her sister to finish speaking. She did not know what kind of woman a duchess was meant to be, not really, not the kind who married for convenience and lived in the shadow of a husband's coldness. But she knew what kind of woman she refused to become. She refused to disappear again. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly, and she wondered if it was Julian, retreating into his own private grief over a proposal that had gone so publicly, catastrophically wrong. She wondered if he lay awake thinking of Beatrice's refusal, replaying the word no in his mind the way Eleanor had replayed 1,000 smaller rejections in hers. She did not know him. She did not love him. But she understood, in some small and unexpected way, what it felt like to stand in front of a room full of people and be told, without kindness, that you were not enough. Perhaps that understanding was not love, but it was something. It was, she thought as she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed, a place to begin. Outside her window, the wind moved through the dry fountain and the clipped hedges, carrying with it the first cold breath of a marriage neither of them had asked for, and neither of them yet understood. Morning came slowly to Ravensworth, gray light easing over the hills long before the household stirred. Eleanor woke early out of habit, dressed herself without calling for a maid, since none had yet been assigned to her, and made her way down to the breakfast room, uncertain what was expected of a new duchess on her first full day, in a house that did not yet feel like hers. She found the room empty except for a single place set at the long table, positioned so far from the head of the table that it left no doubt as to where she was meant to sit. Julian, she was informed by a passing footman, had already breakfasted and ridden out to inspect the eastern fields, a task he apparently preferred to sharing a meal with his new wife. Eleanor sat alone at the enormous table, in the enormous room, in the enormous house that belonged to a man who had married her, in a moment of wounded pride, and now seemed determined to avoid her entirely. She thought of her sister, somewhere in London, likely already receiving visitors eager to hear her account of the scandal, likely already recasting the entire evening into a story where she herself had come out ahead. Let her have the story, Eleanor thought, buttering a piece of bread with more force than necessary. I have the house. It was not much of a victory, but it was hers, and after a lifetime of having nothing that was entirely her own, Eleanor decided it would be enough to start with. She spent the rest of that first day walking the halls of Ravensworth alone, noting the dust that had gathered in corners the housekeeper had clearly stopped inspecting, the covers left over furniture in unused rooms, the general sense of a great house slowly falling into neglect under a master too consumed by business and pride to notice what surrounded him. By the time the sun began to set, Eleanor Lowell, now Eleanor Hale, Duchess of Ravensworth, had already begun making a list in her mind of everything she intended to change. She did not yet know that the man she had married would notice, eventually, every single thing on that list. She did not yet know how much that noticing would come to matter to both of them. Tonight, she only knew that she was tired, and alone, and further from her old life than she had ever imagined she would be by the end of a single evening. She climbed the stairs to her cold blue room, closed the door behind her, and told herself that tomorrow she would begin. The wedding had been swift, and the days that followed it moved just as quickly, though not in any direction Eleanor had expected. By the end of her first week at Ravensworth, she had learned the names of every servant in the main house, from the youngest scullery maid to the elderly groundskeeper who had served 3 generations of Hale Dukes. She learned them not because it was expected of her, but because no one had ever bothered to ask their names before, and Eleanor understood, better than most, what it felt like to go unnoticed in a place where you worked hard and received nothing for it but silence. Mrs. Dobson watched this campaign of small kindnesses with visible suspicion at first. A young maid named Alice, barely 17, nearly dropped a tray of tea when Eleanor thanked her by name and asked how her mother's illness was recovering, a detail Eleanor had overheard in passing and simply remembered, the way she remembered most things that others let slip away. "Nobody's ever asked me that before," Alice admitted, red-faced, setting the tray down with trembling hands. "Not upstairs, anyway." "Then I am glad to be the first," Eleanor said, and meant it. Word of these small conversations spread through the servants' hall faster than any formal announcement could have managed. By the second week, Eleanor noticed that doors seemed to open more quickly when she approached them, that fires were lit in her room before she had to ask, that the cook began sending up small treats she had never requested but had once, in an offhand comment to a passing footman, mentioned as a favorite from her childhood. Julian noticed none of this, or if he did, he said nothing of it. He spent his days occupied with matters of the estate, with correspondence from London, with visits to tenant farms that took him away from the main house for hours at a time. In the evenings, he dined separately, or not at all, and Eleanor grew accustomed to eating her meals in the company of her own thoughts, in the vast dining room that seemed to grow larger with every empty chair. She did not complain. She had agreed to this arrangement after all, had understood plainly what he expected of her on the night of their wedding. But there were moments, quiet ones, usually in the hour before sleep, when she allowed herself to wonder what it might have felt like to be chosen properly, to be a wife a man wanted, rather than a wife a man had settled for in a moment of public humiliation. She pushed those thoughts aside quickly whenever they arose. There was work to be done, and work, Eleanor had learned long ago, was a far more reliable comfort than wishing for things that were unlikely to come. She began with the household accounts, a task Mrs. Dobson clearly resented her taking an interest in, though she could not openly refuse a duchess access to her own home's ledgers. What Eleanor found troubled her. Money was being spent inefficiently across nearly every department. Tradesmen were being overcharged without objection, and stores of linen and silver sat locked away in unused rooms, while the family's everyday supplies grew steadily more worn. "These accounts have not been properly reviewed in years," Eleanor said one afternoon, spreading the ledgers across the desk in the small study she had claimed for her own use. "Did no one think to question these figures?" "His Grace has never asked me to," Mrs. Dobson replied stiffly. "The late Duchess, may she rest peacefully, left these matters entirely in my care." "I am not questioning your care, Mrs. Dobson. I am questioning the numbers." Eleanor kept her tone level, careful not to sound accusing, though she suspected some of what she found bordered on theft by tradesmen who had grown comfortable overcharging a household too distracted to notice. "I should like your help correcting them, if you are willing." There was a long pause, long enough that Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped, if she had finally pushed the older woman past the limits of her patience. Then, slowly, Mrs. Dobson pulled a chair up to the desk and sat down beside her. "The late Duchess never took an interest in these things," she said quietly. "She left everything to me, and to the previous butler, God rest him, and neither of us were given much guidance on how a great house ought to be run. I did my best, my lady, I am not ashamed of that, but I will not pretend I could not use some help." It was the first genuine moment of warmth Eleanor had received since arriving at Ravensworth, and she treasured it more than she expected to. Over the following days, the two women worked together through every ledger in the house, uncovering waste, correcting errors, dismissing one dishonest merchant entirely, and negotiating better terms with 3 others. By the end of the second week, the household's monthly expenses had fallen by nearly a third, without a single reduction in quality or comfort. Eleanor did not stop there. She had noticed, on her first walk through the house, how many rooms sat closed and unused, their furniture draped in white cloth like something waiting to be mourned. She began opening them one by one, airing them out, having the covers removed, filling them with fresh flowers cut from the estate's own neglected gardens. The gardens themselves became her next project, and she spent whole afternoons working alongside the elderly groundskeeper, a quiet man named Fenwick who had all but given up hope that anyone in the family would ever care again about the roses his predecessor had planted for the first Duchess of Ravensworth, nearly 100 years before. "You have a gift for growing things, my lady," Fenwick told her one afternoon, wiping soil from his hands as they knelt together beside a bed of roses that had nearly been lost to neglect. Not many young ladies would dirty their gloves this way. "I was never given much else to do with my hands growing up," Eleanor admitted. "My sister was the one who received dancing lessons and music tutors. I was left to my own devices more often than not. I suppose I simply learned to find things worth doing." Fenwick studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Then Ravensworth is fortunate you found your way here, my lady, whatever the manner of it." Eleanor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, only smiled and returned to her work, and the roses, slowly, over the following weeks, began to bloom again. It was nearly 3 weeks into her marriage before Julian first noticed the changes taking shape around him. He returned from a long ride one evening to find the front hall lit with more candles than usual, the scent of fresh flowers replacing the dust and stillness he had grown so used to that he no longer registered it as a problem. He paused in the doorway, momentarily confused, wondering if he had somehow entered the wrong house. "Your Grace." Mrs. Dobson greeted him with a small, satisfied smile that he had not seen on her face in years. "Dinner will be served within the hour, whenever it suits you." "The house looks different," Julian said, glancing around at rooms he had walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing them. "Has something changed?" "Her Grace has taken quite an interest in the household," Mrs. Dobson replied. "I dare say the estate has not looked this well cared for since your mother's time." Julian said nothing further, but that evening, for the first time since their wedding, he made his way to the dining room at the hour Mrs. Dobson had mentioned, rather than requesting a tray sent to his study, as had become his habit. Eleanor looked up in surprise when he entered, clearly not expecting his company. She had dressed simply, her hair pinned back without the elaborate arrangements Beatrice always insisted upon, and there was a smudge of garden soil still faintly visible along one wrist that she had apparently missed while washing. "Your Grace," she said, rising slightly out of habit before catching herself and settling back into her chair, remembering that this, at least, was now her own table as much as his. "I did not expect you to join me tonight." "I did not expect to find my house transformed in the space of 3 weeks," Julian replied, taking the seat across from her, a seat that had remained empty for every meal since their wedding. "Mrs. Dobson tells me this is your doing." "I hope you do not object," Eleanor said carefully. "I did not think it my place to ask permission for household matters, since you made it clear on our wedding night that you did not intend to concern yourself much with domestic affairs." There was a faint edge to her words, subtle enough that a less observant man might have missed it entirely. Julian did not miss it. He studied his wife across the candlelit table, noting the steadiness in her eyes, the same steadiness he had first noticed on the night of the ball, when everyone else in the ballroom had been either laughing at his humiliation or too frightened to meet his gaze. "You misunderstand me," he said finally. "I do not object. I am simply surprised. Most women in your position would have spent these weeks writing letters to friends in London, complaining of their circumstances, or sulking over the terms of our arrangement. Instead, you have apparently repaired half the accounts and revived my mother's rose garden." "I do not care much for sulking," Eleanor said. "It accomplishes nothing, and I have spent enough of my life waiting for circumstances to improve on their own. I would rather spend my time here doing something useful than pretending I am content to do nothing at all." Julian found himself, for the first time in weeks, genuinely curious about the woman sitting across from him. He had married her out of desperation, a rash decision made in the worst moment of an already humiliating evening, and in the weeks since, he had scarcely allowed himself to think of her as anything more than an obligation, a name attached to a marriage certificate that had saved him from further public embarrassment. He had not considered, until this moment, that she might be someone worth knowing. "Tell me about the accounts," he said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Eleanor told him. She spoke of the overcharging merchants, the wasted stores, the small correction after small correction that had, in total, saved the estate a considerable sum. She spoke with the quiet confidence of a woman who had done real work and knew its value, and Julian listened, at first out of politeness, then increasingly out of genuine interest, asking questions, offering corrections of his own where his knowledge of the estate ran deeper than hers. It was, Eleanor realized somewhere near the end of the meal, the longest conversation they had shared since their wedding night in the carriage. It was not romantic. It was not the sort of conversation poets wrote about, full of longing glances and unspoken feeling. But it was honest, and it was engaged, and for a woman who had spent her entire life being spoken over rather than spoken to, it felt like something worth having. When the meal ended, Julian rose from the table and, for a moment, seemed on the verge of saying something further. Then he simply nodded, thanked her for the evening, and retreated toward his study, leaving Eleanor alone once more with her own thoughts, though this time, the silence that followed him felt different than it had before. She sat a while longer at the long table, turning the strange evening over in her mind. He had noticed her, not the marriage, not the scandal, not the convenience of the arrangement, but her, the work of her hands, the sound of her voice describing something she cared about. It was not much. It was certainly not love. But after 3 weeks of near total silence, it felt, to Eleanor, like the first real crack in a very cold wall. She did not yet know how much wider that crack would grow, or how much trouble it would cause both of them before the year was through. Tonight, she only allowed herself the small, cautious comfort of being seen, and climbed the stairs to her blue room with a lighter step than she had carried in weeks. News of Beatrice Lowell's ruin reached Ravensworth before Beatrice herself did, carried first through a letter from Eleanor's mother, written in a hand so shaky the ink had smudged in places, and confirmed soon after by the kind of gossip that traveled faster than any letter ever could. The wealthy suitor Beatrice had chosen over the Duke, a gentleman named Lord Sedgwick who had presented himself in London society as a man of considerable fortune, had turned out to be nothing of the sort. His estate in the north, it was discovered, existed largely on paper, mortgaged 3 times over to creditors who had finally lost patience and forced the matter into public view. Lord Sedgwick had fled the country within a fortnight of the scandal breaking, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a fiancé whose engagement, once the envy of every young woman in London, had become instead the subject of ridicule. Eleanor read her mother's letter twice, sitting alone in the small study that had become her favorite room in the house. She felt, to her own surprise, very little satisfaction in her sister's downfall. She had expected, if this news ever reached her, to feel some small measure of vindication, some quiet justice for years of being overshadowed and dismissed. Instead, she felt only a tired, familiar weight, the kind that came from watching the same pattern repeat itself, over and over, in a family that never seemed to learn from its mistakes. Her mother's letter ended with a request that Eleanor could not refuse, though every instinct told her she should have. "Your sister has nowhere else to turn," the letter read. "Your father's finances remain too strained to support her properly in London, and the scandal has made it impossible for her to remain in society without protection. I beg you, Eleanor, as your mother, to consider inviting her to Ravensworth, if only for a short while, until this trouble passes and some new arrangement can be found for her future." Eleanor showed the letter to Julian that evening, uncertain how he would receive it. She half expected him to refuse outright, given how publicly and cruelly Beatrice had humiliated him only weeks before. She would not have blamed him if he had. Julian read the letter in silence, his expression giving away nothing. When he finished, he set it down on the desk between them and was quiet for a long moment. "You do not have to agree to this," Eleanor said carefully. "I would understand entirely if you did not wish to have her under this roof, after everything. Do you wish her to come?" Julian asked, and the question surprised her, because it was the first time since their marriage began that he had asked what she herself wanted, rather than simply informing her of what would happen. Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "I do not particularly wish it," she admitted. "My sister and I have never been close, not in the way sisters are meant to be. She has spent most of her life making certain I understood my place beneath her, but she is still my sister, and my mother is right that she has nowhere else to go. I do not think I could live with myself if I turned her away entirely, whatever she has done to either of us." Julian studied his wife across the desk, noting, not for the first time, the strange steadiness with which she seemed to approach even the most painful subjects. She did not pretend not to feel the old hurt. She simply refused to let it decide her actions. "Then she may come," Julian said finally, "on the condition that she conducts herself with proper respect toward you, in this house, in front of the staff, and in front of me. I will not have her repeat the performance she gave at that ball." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, and meant it, though a small, uneasy feeling settled in her stomach that she could not quite name. Beatrice arrived at Ravensworth 8 days later, in a carriage far less grand than the one she had traveled in during her days as London's most celebrated beauty. She stepped down looking thinner than Eleanor remembered, her fine clothes slightly out of fashion now, though she still carried herself with the same practiced elegance that had always made rooms fall silent when she entered them. "Eleanor," Beatrice said, embracing her sister with a warmth that felt, to Eleanor, entirely unfamiliar, and therefore entirely suspicious. "How well you look. Married life clearly agrees with you." "Beatrice." Eleanor returned the embrace briefly, then stepped back. "I am sorry for your troubles. I hope you will find some peace here, however long you stay." Beatrice's eyes moved past her sister, taking in the newly restored front hall, the fresh flowers, the polished silver visible through the open doors of the dining room, and something flickered across her face that Eleanor recognized instantly, though it had been years since she had last seen it directed at herself. It was envy, quiet and immediate, the same expression Beatrice had worn as a girl whenever Eleanor received even the smallest attention their mother had failed to give her. "You have done well for yourself," Beatrice said, and though the words were pleasant enough, there was an edge beneath them that Eleanor did not miss. Julian's household had arranged a small dinner that first evening, more formal than their usual private meals, with several neighboring families invited to welcome Beatrice properly, and to satisfy the curiosity that had inevitably followed her arrival. Eleanor had not wanted the dinner at all, sensing that any public gathering involving her sister carried risk, but Julian had insisted it was necessary, that avoiding the subject entirely would only invite more gossip than confronting it directly. The dinner began well enough. Beatrice, whatever her faults, had always known how to charm a room, and she applied that skill fully to the assembled guests, speaking with careful modesty about her recent misfortune, framing herself as a woman wronged by a deceitful suitor, rather than a woman who had made a foolish and public choice. By the time the second course arrived, more than one gentleman at the table was regarding her with open sympathy, and Eleanor found herself watching her sister with a familiar, weary sense of déjà vu. It was during the third course that Beatrice turned her attention, for the first time that evening, directly toward Julian. "I must say, Your Grace, this house has never looked lovelier," she said, her voice carrying easily down the length of the table. "I remember visiting once, Years ago, when your mother was still alive. It was beautiful then, of course, but there was always a certain coldness to it, if you will forgive my saying so. It feels quite different now. My wife has taken a great interest in the household, Julian said evenly. The improvements are entirely her doing. How resourceful of her, Beatrice said, smiling in Eleanor's direction with an expression that did not quite reach her eyes. I confess I never gave her enough credit for such talents growing up. Our mother always said Eleanor had a practical mind. I suppose I never understood what she meant until now. The comment was delivered lightly enough that most of the table likely heard nothing more than a compliment. But Eleanor heard the years of condescension folded carefully inside it, the implication that practical was a lesser quality than the beauty and charm Beatrice had always been praised for, that Eleanor's usefulness had only ever been noticed once it became convenient to notice it. Thank you, Beatrice, Eleanor said, keeping her voice pleasant, refusing to let the old sting show on her face in front of a table full of guests. I have always found practical minds accomplish a great deal more than pretty words in the end. A few guests laughed softly at that, and Eleanor caught, out of the corner of her eye, the faintest flicker of something like approval crossing Julian's expression. Beatrice's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing further on the subject, turning instead to charm the gentleman seated beside her with practiced ease. The conversation moved on, as dinner conversations do, but Eleanor found herself watching her sister more closely for the remainder of the meal, noting the way Beatrice's eyes kept returning to Julian, lingering a moment too long, studying him with an interest that had nothing to do with sisterly curiosity. It was a look Eleanor recognized from years of watching Beatrice size up every eligible man who crossed her path, a calculating assessment of value and opportunity that had nothing whatsoever to do with affection. She told herself she was imagining it. Beatrice had, after all, rejected Julian outright, humiliated him publicly, chosen another man entirely over the security a duke could have offered her. It seemed absurd to imagine that same woman now regarding him with anything resembling regret. And yet, later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Eleanor passed the drawing room on her way upstairs and heard her sister's voice, low and warm, speaking to someone within. She paused, uncertain whether to enter, and through the partially open door, she saw Beatrice standing close to Julian by the fireplace, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her head tilted in the particular way she had always used to make men feel as though they were the only interesting person in any room. Such a shame we never had the chance to know each other better, before all this, Beatrice was saying, her voice pitched low enough that Eleanor had to strain to hear it. I confess, Your Grace, I have wondered more than once what might have happened, had I made a wiser choice that night. Eleanor did not wait to hear Julian's reply. She turned and climbed the stairs quickly, her heart beating faster than the moment warranted, telling herself firmly that whatever her husband said or did not say to her sister was none of her concern, that their marriage had never been built on anything resembling jealousy, that she had no right to feel the sharp, unwelcome twist in her chest that had risen the moment she saw Beatrice's hand resting on his sleeve. She told herself all of this quite firmly and did not believe a single word of it by the time she reached her cold blue room and closed the door behind her. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake listening to the settling sounds of the old house, the wind moving through the gardens she had spent so many hours restoring, and wondered, not for the first time since her wedding, exactly what kind of marriage she had agreed to, and exactly how much danger her sister's presence beneath this roof might come to represent. She was, though she did not yet know it, entirely right to worry. In the days that followed, Julian found himself doing something he had not expected, and could not entirely explain even to himself. He began seeking out his wife's company, not out of any obligation the marriage required of him, but simply because he wanted to. It began with small things. He would linger a few extra minutes at breakfast, asking her opinion on a matter of estate business he would once have decided entirely alone. He began riding out to the tenant farms later in the morning than he used to, so that he might first walk with her through the gardens she had brought back to life, listening as she named each flower and explained, with quiet enthusiasm, which varieties Fenwick believed would bloom best come summer. He found himself more than once standing outside the door of her small study in the evening, an excuse for the visit already prepared on his lips, though the excuse rarely mattered once he was inside and she looked up from her ledgers with that same steady, unhurried attention she seemed to give everything. He did not examine too closely why he sought her out. He told himself it was simple curiosity, that a man ought to know something of the woman who shared his name and his house, that it would be strange indeed to remain strangers under one roof for the rest of their lives. He did not allow himself to consider that curiosity had, somewhere in the past weeks, begun to feel like something warmer. Eleanor noticed the change immediately, and found herself uncertain what to make of it. She had built her expectations of this marriage carefully, brick by brick, in the days following her wedding, constructing a version of her future that required nothing from Julian beyond civility and financial security. She had told herself, quite firmly, that she did not need his affection, that she had survived a lifetime without her family's warmth, and could certainly survive a marriage without her husband's. It had seemed, for the first weeks, a perfectly manageable arrangement. Now, with Julian seeking her out more and more, lingering in doorways, asking questions that seemed to carry genuine interest rather than polite obligation, Eleanor found the careful walls she had built beginning to feel less like protection, and more like a burden she was not certain she wished to keep carrying. But she did not trust it. She had spent too many years watching attention shift away from her the moment something more interesting appeared, had watched her sister capture every room the moment she chose to enter it. She did not believe, not fully, that Julian's growing interest in her would survive any real test. That test arrived sooner than she expected, at a garden party hosted by a neighboring family, the Ashcombs, whose estate bordered Ravensworth's northern fields. It was Beatrice's first public appearance since her arrival, and she had clearly spent considerable effort preparing for it, arriving in a gown that, while not quite as fine as her London wardrobe, still managed to draw admiring glances from nearly every guest present. Eleanor watched her sister work the crowd with the same practiced skill she always had, moving from group to group, laughing at the right moments, offering just enough vulnerability about her recent misfortune to earn sympathy without appearing pitiable. It was, Eleanor thought, watching from a slight distance, a masterful performance, and she found herself almost admiring it, the way one might admire a skill entirely divorced from any question of whether it ought to be admired. The trouble began near the lake, where a small gathering had assembled to watch a group of younger guests attempt a boating excursion that seemed destined for disaster from the moment the first boat was pushed away from the shore. Julian had drifted toward this gathering after concluding a lengthy conversation with Lord Ashcombe about matters of local farming, and Beatrice, apparently sensing an opportunity, moved to join him almost immediately. Eleanor, standing some distance away in conversation with Lady Ashcombe, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. Beatrice positioned herself close beside Julian, laughing at something he had said, resting her hand briefly on his arm in the same manner Eleanor had witnessed weeks before in the drawing room. Several guests nearby had clearly noticed as well, their conversations pausing slightly, their eyes flickering between the Duke and the beautiful young woman at his side, then searching for Eleanor herself, no doubt eager to see how the wife might react to such a public display. "Your sister seems quite recovered from her troubles," Lady Ashcombe observed, her tone carefully neutral, though her eyes carried the same curiosity as everyone else's. "She has always known how to present herself well," Eleanor replied, keeping her own voice light, though her attention remained fixed, despite her best efforts, on the scene by the lake. What happened next, Eleanor would later learn from 3 separate accounts, all slightly different in their details, but agreeing on the essential facts. Beatrice, growing bolder as the conversation continued, had said something that drew a small crowd's attention, something about regretting the choices that had led her away from a match she now recognized as far superior to the one she had foolishly pursued. She had said it, according to those who heard it, with her hand still resting on Julian's arm, her eyes turned up toward his with an expression that left little doubt about her meaning. Julian, for his part, did not respond the way Beatrice had clearly hoped. He stepped back from her touch, deliberately and without apology, his expression turning cold in a way that several guests would later describe with obvious relish when recounting the story. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice carrying further than perhaps he intended, loud enough that Eleanor, still standing beside Lady Ashcombe, heard every word clearly across the lawn. "I think you misunderstand the nature of our acquaintance. Whatever regrets you carry regarding your own choices are entirely your own to bear. I have made mine, and I do not share them." He did not wait for her reply. He turned, quite deliberately, and crossed the lawn toward his wife, leaving Beatrice standing alone by the lake, her face flushed with an embarrassment she had clearly not anticipated, surrounded by guests who were now whispering with an entirely different sort of interest than they had shown moments before. "Eleanor," Julian said, reaching her side and offering his arm with a formality that felt, to Eleanor, entirely deliberate, a public gesture meant to be seen and understood by everyone present. "Would you walk with me? I believe the roses near the East Terrace are worth admiring before the light fades." Eleanor took his arm, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit, though she kept her expression carefully composed as they walked away together. leaving her sister's humiliation behind them like something already forgotten. They walked in silence for several minutes, past hedges and flower beds, the sounds of the garden party fading gradually behind them. Eleanor waited for Julian to speak first, uncertain what to say herself, her mind still turning over the scene by the lake, the coldness in his voice, the way he had walked directly to her afterward without hesitation. "I owe you an explanation," Julian said finally, once they had reached the quiet of the East Terrace, away from curious eyes, "for your sister's behavior, and for my own." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said. "You did not encourage her." "No," Julian agreed, "I did not, but I should have made my feelings clearer weeks ago when I first began to suspect the direction of her attention. I did not wish to cause trouble in your family, given everything else your sister has already endured. I see now that my silence only allowed her to believe there was something worth pursuing." Eleanor considered this carefully. "And is there?" she asked, before she could stop herself, the question slipping out with more vulnerability than she had intended to show. "Something worth her pursuing, I mean." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open, stripped of the careful formality he usually maintained. "No," he said, without hesitation. "There is not. I proposed to your sister once, out of practical necessity, in a moment I barely remember with any real feeling attached to it. Whatever I felt that night was wounded pride, nothing more. It did not survive the walk across that ballroom floor. What I feel now, standing here, is something entirely different." Eleanor's breath caught slightly, though she tried not to let it show. "And what is that, Your Grace?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading afternoon light, and Eleanor found herself holding perfectly still, waiting, though she could not have said what exactly she was waiting for. "I am not entirely certain yet," he admitted finally, with a rare honesty that surprised them both, "but I know it is not convenience, not anymore." He did not say more than that, and Eleanor did not ask him to, sensing that the moment, fragile as it was, needed room to breathe rather than further questioning. They stood together on the quiet terrace a while longer, watching the sun sink lower over the hills, and when they finally returned to the party, walking side by side rather than at their usual careful distance, more than one guest noticed the change and began, quietly, to speculate about what it might mean. Beatrice noticed it too, from across the lawn, and whatever plan she had begun forming in that humiliating moment by the lake sharpened, in that instant, into something considerably more dangerous than simple flirtation. She had lost Julian once, through her own careless rejection. She did not intend to watch her forgettable younger sister keep him without a fight. Beatrice waited nearly a fortnight before she acted, long enough that no one would connect her scheme to the humiliation she had suffered at the garden party, long enough that her quiet, wounded manner around the house had convinced even Mrs. Dobson that she had accepted her place as a temporary and grateful guest. She had not accepted anything of the sort. She began carefully, the way she had always approached matters that required patience rather than immediate reward. She befriended a young lady's maid new to the household, a girl named Peggy who had come to Ravensworth only a month earlier, and had not yet learned to distrust the charming, sympathetic older sister who took an interest in her small troubles, and offered kind words when no one else seemed to notice her. Beatrice spent several afternoons cultivating this friendship, listening patiently to Peggy's complaints about wages and long hours, offering sympathy and small gifts of ribbon and lace that a lady's maid could rarely afford for herself. It was through Peggy, weeks later, that Beatrice learned a detail about Eleanor's past that she had nearly forgotten herself, a small, unremarkable fact from their shared girlhood that, twisted carefully, and presented with the right emphasis, could be transformed into something considerably more damaging. Years before, when Eleanor was barely 17, she had briefly corresponded with a young curate her mother had considered entirely unsuitable, a poor man with no fortune and no prospects, whose letters Eleanor had kept hidden in a small box beneath her bed until her mother discovered them and put an immediate end to the acquaintance. Nothing improper had ever occurred between them beyond a handful of innocent letters exchanged over the course of a single summer, letters that spoke mostly of books they had both read, and small observations about the world neither of them expected the other to understand. It was, in truth, the sort of harmless girlhood attachment that most young women experienced at one point or another, forgotten quickly once a more serious courtship arrived. But Beatrice understood, better than almost anyone, how a story could be reshaped depending on who told it, and how. She began, carefully and anonymously, planting the seeds of a rumor among the neighboring families who had attended the garden party, families still curious about the sudden warmth that had grown visible between the Duke and his once overlooked wife. The rumor suggested, without quite stating outright, that Eleanor Hale had a secret history, an improper attachment from her youth that had been hastily buried by her family, that her sudden marriage to the Duke had been arranged with unusual speed, precisely because certain facts about her past needed to remain hidden from public scrutiny. It was not entirely a lie, which made it considerably more dangerous than an outright falsehood would have been. There had been letters, there had been a young curate. Beatrice simply left out every detail that made the truth harmless and allowed her listeners' imaginations to fill in the rest. The rumor spread slowly at first, the way all effective rumors do, whispered between friends over tea, mentioned in passing during calls, until it had traveled far enough that it reached Julian himself, delivered not by any malicious intent but by a well-meaning acquaintance who thought, mistakenly, that the Duke ought to know what people were saying about his wife. Julian did not believe it, not at first, but the seed had been planted, and doubt, once introduced, has a way of growing regardless of a man's best intentions to resist it. He found himself, in the days that followed, watching Eleanor with a new and uncomfortable attention, searching her face for signs of a secret she might be keeping from him, replaying small moments from their weeks together, wondering whether her quiet steadiness concealed something he had failed to notice. He did not confront her directly, not at first, and his silence, though he did not intend it as coldness, felt to Eleanor exactly like the wall he had first raised between them on their wedding night. She noticed the change in him almost immediately, the way his questions grew more careful, the way he no longer lingered at her study door in the evenings, the way conversations that had once flowed easily between them now felt strained and formal, weighted with something unspoken. "Have I done something to displease you?" Eleanor finally asked, nearly 2 weeks after the garden party, unable to bear the growing distance any longer. They sat together in the drawing room after dinner, a fire burning low in the grate, and Julian had spent the better part of an hour staring into the flames rather than engaging in the easy conversation that had become their habit. "No," Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Why do you ask?" "Because you have been distant with me these past days, and I would rather know the reason than continue guessing at it." Julian was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to raise the subject at all. Finally, reluctantly, he told her what he had heard, the rumor of a hidden attachment, an improper history her family had rushed to conceal through a hasty marriage. Eleanor felt the color drain from her face, not from guilt, but from the particular sting of watching something small and innocent from her past be twisted into a weapon against her. There was a curate, she admitted quietly, meeting his eyes without flinching, refusing to let shame color a memory that had never deserved it. "I was 17. We exchanged letters over the course of a single summer, about books we had both read, about nothing more improper than that. My mother discovered the letters and ended the correspondence immediately. I have not thought of him in years. Whatever you have heard has been made into something it was never meant to be." "I want to believe you," Julian said, and the admission cost him something visible, a crack in his usual composure. "But you do not," Eleanor said, and the quiet devastation in her voice was worse, somehow, than if she had shouted at him. "After everything, Julian, after everything we have built these past weeks, you would rather believe a rumor whispered by strangers than the word of the woman who has shared your table and your name." "I did not say I believed it," Julian said, though his hesitation had already answered the question for both of them. Eleanor rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly, though she kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I think you should consider carefully where this rumor came from," she said. "I think you should ask yourself who benefits most from convincing you that your wife cannot be trusted." She left the room before he could answer, climbing the stairs to her cold blue room with a hollow feeling settling deep in her chest, the same hollow feeling she remembered from years of watching her sister take whatever she wanted, leaving nothing but scraps and doubt behind for Eleanor to gather up afterward. The following days were the coldest of their marriage, colder even than the distant formality of their earliest weeks together. Julian did not raise the subject again, but neither did he seek her company the way he had before, and Eleanor, wounded by his hesitation, made no effort to close the distance herself. She had spent her entire life being doubted, being weighed and found wanting beside her sister's brighter, easier charm, and she found she did not have the strength left to fight for a husband who could not decide, even briefly, to trust her over a whispered rumor, with no real substance behind it. She began, quietly, to make plans of her own. She wrote to a distant aunt in the north, a woman she had corresponded with occasionally over the years, asking whether a visit might be possible, framing the request vaguely enough that it would not immediately signal the collapse of her marriage, though privately, Eleanor understood exactly what she was doing. She was preparing to leave, not out of anger exactly, but out of a tired, familiar instinct to remove herself from a situation before it could hurt her any further than it already had. Beatrice, watching this unfolding distance from the edges of the household with carefully concealed satisfaction, decided the moment had come to press her advantage further. She sought out Julian one evening while Eleanor was occupied elsewhere, finding him alone in his study, and offered, with an expression of gentle concern that did not match the calculation behind her eyes, to share what she claimed was further information about the curate, details she framed as reluctant honesty offered only out of concern for the Duke's welfare. It was in fact an outright fabrication, details invented entirely from nothing, designed to deepen the doubt already growing between husband and wife. Beatrice delivered it with the same practiced skill she had always possessed, and for a moment, watching Julian's face carefully as he absorbed her words, she believed her plan had succeeded completely. She did not yet know that Peggy, the young lady's maid she had befriended so carefully weeks before, had begun to feel increasingly uneasy about the whole affair, troubled by the growing coldness between the Duke and Duchess she had come to admire, and had confided her worries, hesitantly, to Mrs. Dobson only that same afternoon, describing exactly how Lady Beatrice had first learned the story of the curate's letters, and exactly what she had asked Peggy to help her spread. The truth was already beginning to unravel, even as Beatrice sat in the Duke's study, believing herself on the very edge of victory. She simply did not know it yet. Eleanor, unaware of any of this, spent that same evening finishing her letter to her aunt, sealing it with a heavy heart, and told herself, as she climbed once more into her cold and lonely bed, that she had survived worse losses than this one, and that she would survive this too, whatever it eventually cost her. Mrs. Dobson had served the Hale family for nearly 30 years, and in all that time, she had learned to hold her tongue on matters that were not strictly her business, but she had also grown, in the months since Eleanor's arrival, into something she had not expected to feel toward any mistress of Ravensworth: genuine loyalty. She had watched the young Duchess restore this house, room by room, with her own 2 hands and her own quiet determination, and she was not prepared to stand by silently while a scheming sister destroyed everything that patient work had built. She went to Julian directly, the morning after Peggy's confession, before he had risen from breakfast, and told him plainly and without embellishment exactly what the young maid had described. Lady Beatrice had sought Peggy out deliberately weeks earlier. Lady Beatrice had asked pointed questions about Eleanor's girlhood, questions that seemed unusual even to a girl as inexperienced as Peggy. Lady Beatrice had, on more than one occasion, instructed Peggy to mention certain details to other members of the household staff. Details Peggy now understood, with growing horror, had been carefully designed to spread and grow with each retelling. Julian listened in silence, his expression darkening with every word, and by the time Mrs. Dobson finished, his breakfast sat forgotten and cold on the table before him. "Bring the girl to me," he said quietly. "I would hear it from her directly." Peggy arrived trembling, certain she was about to be dismissed for her part in the scheme, and it took several minutes of careful, patient questioning before Julian managed to draw the full account from her, gently enough that the frightened girl finally understood she was not the one in danger of punishment. She described, in halting detail, every conversation, every question, every small instruction Beatrice had given her over the preceding weeks, including the final and most damning detail. Beatrice had told her, only 2 days before, that she intended to speak with the Duke herself and offer what she called further proof she had, in fact, invented entirely from nothing. By the time Peggy finished, Julian understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly what he had done. He had allowed a whispered rumor, planted deliberately by a woman with every reason to want his marriage destroyed, to poison weeks of trust he and Eleanor had built together, brick by careful brick, since that first honest conversation over dinner. He had doubted his wife, however briefly, however much he had told himself he had not truly believed the rumor, and that doubt alone had been enough to drive her into a silence he now recognized, with sudden dread, as the silence of a woman preparing to leave. He found the letter to her aunt sitting sealed on the desk in her study, discovered entirely by accident when he went searching for her, and found the room empty. Her absence explained a moment later by a passing footman who informed him that her Grace had gone walking in the gardens, as she often did in the mornings, and had left instructions that the letter be sent to the post that same afternoon. Julian read the direction on the envelope and felt something close to panic rise in his chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome feeling for a man who had spent his entire adult life priding himself on his composure. He found Beatrice first, in the drawing room, arranging flowers with the serene satisfaction of a woman who believed her plan had already succeeded. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting immediately into practiced warmth. "Your Grace," she began, "I hope you have had time to consider what I know what you have done," Julian said, his voice cutting through her words with a coldness that made her smile falter, for the first time since her arrival at Ravensworth. "I have spoken with Peggy. I know about the questions you asked her, the instructions you gave her, the story you invented from a handful of harmless letters exchanged when my wife was barely more than a child. I know, in short, exactly what kind of woman you truly are, and I am ashamed that I allowed your lies to affect my marriage even for a single day." Beatrice's composure cracked visibly, her carefully arranged flowers forgotten in her hands. "Julian, please. You must understand. I only wanted—" "You wanted what you have always wanted," Julian said. "Attention that belongs to someone else. You had your chance with me once, Lady Beatrice, and you rejected it in front of the entire city, loudly enough that I still remember every word of it. That rejection was, I have come to understand, the greatest kindness you ever did me, because it led me directly to a woman worth 10 of you in every way that matters. I will not allow you to destroy what I nearly lost the good sense to recognize." He did not wait for her response. He turned and left the drawing room, leaving Beatrice standing alone amid her scattered flowers. Her scheme unraveled entirely. Her welcome at Ravensworth ended the moment the words left his mouth, though the formal details of her departure would be arranged, coldly and efficiently, by Mrs. Dobson within the hour. Julian found Eleanor exactly where the footman had said she would be, in the garden she had brought back to life with her own hands, standing near the roses she had spent so many quiet afternoons restoring alongside old Fenwick. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path and turned, her expression carefully guarded, the same steady composure she had worn since that first ballroom encounter months before, though Julian could see now, looking closely, how much effort that composure cost her. "I know about the letter," he said, before she could speak, before his own courage could fail him. "I know about your aunt, and I know why you wrote to her. I came to ask you not to send it." Eleanor's expression did not soften immediately. "Give me one reason, Julian, why I should stay in a marriage where my husband would rather believe a stranger's rumor than his own wife's word." "I have no good reason," Julian admitted, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise her, softening, however slightly, the wall she had built around herself. "I behaved badly. I allowed doubt to take root where it never should have grown, and I let my silence hurt you when I should have trusted you completely, from the very first moment you told me the truth. I have spoken to your sister. I know now exactly what she did, and why, and I have sent her from this house, permanently, effective this afternoon." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at this, though she said nothing yet, waiting to hear the rest. "I do not ask you to forgive me because I deserve it," Julian continued, closing the distance between them until he stood only a few feet away, close enough that she could see the raw uncertainty in his expression, an uncertainty she had never once witnessed in him before, not even on the worst night of their wedding. "I ask you to forgive me because I have discovered, these past months, that I cannot imagine this house, or this life, without you in it. What began as convenience became something else entirely, somewhere between the roses and the ledgers and the evenings I found myself inventing excuses simply to hear your voice. I did not offer you my heart when I offered you my name, Eleanor, and that was my failure, not yours. I am offering it to you now, fully, whatever the cost of my earlier foolishness, if you will still have it." Eleanor stood very still, studying his face in the morning light, searching for any trace of the calculation, the performance, that she had grown so accustomed to recognizing in her sister. She found none of it. What she found instead was a man standing before her without armor, without pride, offering her something she had never expected to receive from him, or from anyone. "You hurt me," she said quietly, because it was true, and because she had spent too long swallowing her own hurt to allow it to pass unspoken now. "I know," Julian said, "and I will spend as long as it takes proving to you that I will not make that mistake again. But I cannot make that promise from a distance, Eleanor, and I cannot make it if you send that letter to your aunt and disappear from this house before I have the chance to show you." Eleanor looked down at her hands, then back up at him, and something in her expression shifted, softened, though she did not yet fully surrender the careful guard she had built around her heart. "I have spent my whole life watching people choose my sister over me," she said. "I do not know if I can survive watching my own husband do the same, even once." "I chose wrong once," Julian said, "in a ballroom, in a moment of wounded pride, before I knew you at all. I am not that same foolish man any longer, and I did not, in the end, choose your sister today. I chose to send her away, and I chose to come find you in this garden, and I will choose you again tomorrow, and every day after that, for as long as you will allow me the privilege." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Julian began to fear he had said too little, too late, that the damage of the preceding weeks could not be undone by words alone, however honestly meant. Then Eleanor stepped forward, closing the last small distance between them, and Julian felt, for the first time since he had known her, the full and unguarded weight of her trust settling back into place. "Do not make me regret this," she said softly. "I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never do," Julian answered, and when he finally took her hand, there was nothing careful or formal about the gesture at all. The letter to her aunt was never sent. Instead, that same afternoon, Eleanor burned it in the small fireplace of her study, watching the paper curl and blacken with something close to relief, while below in the front hall, Beatrice's carriage pulled away from Ravensworth for the final time, carrying with it the last remnants of a scheme that had, in the end, accomplished nothing but strengthening the very marriage it had been designed to destroy. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Julian did not retreat to his study after dinner, and Eleanor did not climb the stairs alone to her cold blue room. They sat together instead by the drawing-room fire, speaking of small things and large ones, of roses and ledgers and the strange, unlikely path that had brought them to this quiet, hopeful moment together, and neither of them noticed, or cared, how late the hour had grown before they finally said goodnight. Spring came early to Ravensworth the following year, the roses blooming a full month ahead of Fenwick's usual predictions, though the old groundskeeper insisted, with a rare smile, that the garden was simply responding to the happiness of the household it served. Eleanor stood among those roses on a bright morning nearly a year after her wedding, watching Julian cross the lawn toward her with a bundle of letters in hand, correspondence from London that had arrived with the morning post. He had taken to bringing her the mail himself these days, a small habit that had grown between them without either of them quite noticing when it began, one of many small habits that now filled the quiet hours of their marriage with a warmth neither of them had expected to find in a match that had begun so publicly and so badly. "News from your mother," Julian said, handing her the top letter with a smile. "And something else, addressed to both of us. From the Ashcombs. It seems they are hosting another garden party come summer, and specifically request that we attend together this time, rather than arriving separately as we did last year." Eleanor laughed softly at that, remembering the tension of that first garden party, the coldness in Julian's voice as he had turned away from Beatrice, the walk along the east terrace that had marked, though neither of them fully understood it at the time, the true beginning of their marriage. "I imagine we shall give them rather less to gossip about this time." "I would not be so certain," Julian said, his eyes warm with affection as he watched her open her mother's letter. "You are still, after all this time, the most interesting woman in any room you enter. I doubt Lady Ashcombe's guests will find you any less fascinating, simply because scandal no longer follows you." Eleanor's mother wrote with her usual scattered warmth, full of small news from home, questions about the household, gentle hints about grandchildren, that Eleanor read with a private smile she did not yet share with Julian, though she suspected, from the particular softness in his eyes lately, that he had already begun to guess at the news she was preparing to tell him. Buried near the end of the letter was a brief mention of Beatrice, the first Eleanor had received in several months. Her sister, it seemed, had settled in a smaller town some distance from London, had accepted, finally and without much grace, a quieter match with a modest gentleman of respectable but unremarkable fortune, a man who wanted nothing more from his wife than pleasant company and a well-kept home. It was not the grand life Beatrice had always imagined for herself, but it was, by all accounts, a stable one, and Eleanor found she could read the news now without the old tangle of resentment and hurt that had once accompanied any mention of her sister's name. Whatever Beatrice had cost her, in scheming and cruelty and years of careless dismissal, Eleanor had, in the end, built something from the wreckage that Beatrice, for all her charm and beauty, had never managed to secure for herself, a marriage built on honesty rather than performance, a home that welcomed her rather than merely tolerating her presence, a husband who had learned, through hard and humbling experience, exactly what it meant to choose someone fully, and to keep choosing them, every single day. Ravensworth itself had transformed as thoroughly as the marriage that governed it. The household accounts, once riddled with waste and neglect, now ran with quiet efficiency under Eleanor's careful attention, freeing funds that had gone toward improving conditions for the tenant farmers, toward proper wages for the household staff, toward a small school Eleanor had established in the nearby village for children whose families could not otherwise afford schooling, a project that had begun as a passing conversation with Mrs. Dobson, and grown, over the following months, into one of the great satisfactions of Eleanor's new life. The rose gardens bloomed more magnificently each season than the last, tended now by 2 additional gardeners Fenwick had trained himself, proud beyond words of the legacy he would leave behind in hands he trusted completely. Mrs. Dobson, once so carefully guarded in her loyalty, had become something close to a trusted friend, the 2 women having weathered the crisis of Beatrice's scheme together, and emerged from it with a bond that ran considerably deeper than the formal relationship between mistress and housekeeper usually allowed. Peggy, the young maid whose confession had ultimately unraveled Beatrice's plot, had been promoted, at Eleanor's personal recommendation, to a position of greater responsibility within the household, a reward for courage that had cost the frightened girl a great deal to offer. And Julian himself had changed most of all, though he would have been the first to admit, with characteristic honesty, that the change had come slowly, and had required considerable humbling along the way. The cold, guarded man who had proposed to a stranger out of wounded pride, who had insisted on separate wings and separate lives, who had allowed a whispered rumor to shake weeks of hard-won trust, had given way, gradually, to a husband who sought his wife's company not out of obligation but out of genuine, unhurried joy, who trusted her completely, who had learned, through nearly losing her, exactly how much her steady presence had come to mean to him. That evening, as the sun set gold and warm over the restored gardens of Ravensworth, Julian and Eleanor walked together along the same terrace where he had first admitted, however incompletely, that his feelings for her had grown into something he did not yet fully understand. He understood it fully now, and he told her so again, as he had taken to doing often in the months since, not because she doubted him any longer, but because some truths were worth repeating simply for the pleasure of saying them aloud. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, as they paused near the roses, her hand resting lightly in his, "about that night at the ball, about how frightened I was, standing there, watching my sister humiliate you in front of everyone, certain I was about to witness another disaster in a life that had already seen its share of them." "And what have you concluded?" Julian asked, smiling down at her with the easy warmth that had become as natural to him now as his old coldness once had been. "That I have never been more grateful for a humiliation in my entire life," Eleanor said, laughing softly. "If Beatrice had accepted your proposal that night, I would still be sitting in some corner of my parents' house, waiting for a life that belonged to someone else." "Then I suppose I owe your sister a strange sort of thanks," Julian said, "for teaching me, in the cruelest possible way, exactly what I did not want, and leading me, quite by accident, directly to exactly what I did." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last light fade behind the hills, the roses closing gently around them in the cooling evening air, the great house behind them glowing warm and welcoming, in a way it had not glowed in years before her arrival. She had come to Ravensworth as a rejected woman's afterthought, a convenience offered in a moment of public shame, expected to live quietly in the shadow of a marriage that promised her nothing beyond security and a name. She had built instead from that unpromising beginning a life entirely her own, a home restored by her own hands, a husband who had learned, through hard and necessary lessons, to offer her not merely his convenience but the whole of his heart. It was not the beginning either of them would have chosen, if given the choice from the very start, but standing together now, in the golden light of a life neither had expected, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that they would not have traded this particular ending for any other beginning in the world.